Hey, welcome back, YouTubers, to the Evil Bad Book Club. Today we'll be reading Chapter 27 of the Turner Diaries. Stay tuned. October 28, 1994. Just back from more than a month in Baltimore. What's left of it. I and four others from here hauled a batch of portable radioactivity metering equipment up to Silver Spring, where we linked up with a Maryland unit that continued north to the vicinity of Baltimore. Since the main roads were totally impassable, we had to walk across country more than halfway, commandeering a truck for only the last dozen miles. Although more than 2 weeks had passed since the bombing, the state of affairs around Baltimore was almost indescribably chaotic when we arrived. We didn't even try to go into the burned out core of the city, but even in the suburbs and countryside 10 miles west of Ground Zero, half the buildings had burned. Even the secondary roads in and around the suburbs were littered with the burned hulks of vehicles, and nearly everyone we encountered was on foot. Groups of scavengers were everywhere, poking through ruined stores, foraging in the fields with backpacks, carrying bundles of looted or salvaged goods, mostly food, but also clothing, building materials, and everything else imaginable, to and fro like an army of ants. And the corpses, they were another good reason for staying away from the roads as much as possible. Even in the areas where relatively few people were killed by the initial blast or by subsequent radiation sickness, the corpses were strewn along the roads by the thousands. They were nearly all refugees from the blast area. Close to the city, one saw the bodies of those who had been badly burned by the fireball. Most of them had not been able to walk more than a mile or so before they collapsed. Farther out were those who had been less seriously burned, and far out into the countryside were the corpses of those who had succumbed to radiation days or weeks later. All had been left to rot where they fell, except in those few areas where the military had restored a semblance of order. We had at that time only about 40 organization members among the survivors in the Baltimore area. They had been engaged in sabotage, sniping, and other guerrilla efforts against the police and military personnel there during the first week after the blast. Then they gradually discovered that the rules of the game had changed. They found out that it was no longer necessary to operate as furtively as they had before. The system's troops returned their fire when attacked, but did not pursue them. Outside a few areas, the police no longer attempted to undertake systematic searches of persons and vehicles, and there were no house raids. The attitude almost seemed to be, don't bother us, and we won't bother you. The civilian survivors also tended to take a much more nearly neutral attitude than before. There was fear of the organization, but very little overt expression of hostility. The people did not know whether we were the ones who had fired the missile which destroyed their city, as the system broadcasts claimed, but they seemed about as disposed to blame the system for letting it happen as us for doing it. The Holocaust through which the people up there had passed had clearly convinced them quite thoroughly of one thing. The system could no longer guarantee their security. They no longer had even a trace of confidence in the old order. They merely wanted to survive now, and they would turn to anyone who could help them stay alive a while longer. Sensing this changed attitude, Our members had begun recruiting and organizing among the survivors around Baltimore in semi-public fashion, and meeting with sufficient success that Revolutionary Command authorized the attempt to establish a small liberated zone west of the city. The 11 of us who had come up from the Washington suburbs to help pitched in with enthusiasm, and within a few days we had established a reasonably defensible perimeter enclosing about 2,000 houses and other buildings, with a total of nearly 12,000 occupants. My principal function was to carry out a radiological survey of the soil, the buildings, the local vegetation, and the water resources in the area, so that we could be sure of freedom from dangerous levels of nuclear radiation resulting from fallout. We organized about 300 of the locals into a fairly effective militia and provided them with arms. It would be risky at this stage to try to arm a bigger militia than that, because we haven't had an opportunity to ideologically condition the local population to the extent we'd like, and they still require close observation and tight supervision. But we picked the best prospects among the able-bodied males in the enclave, and we do have quite a bit of experience in picking people. I'll not be surprised if half our new militiamen eventually graduate to members in the organization, and some will probably even be admitted to the order. Yes, I think that, by and large, we can count on our new recruits. There's still a great deal of basically sound human material left in this country, despite the widespread moral corruption. After all, the corruption has been produced largely by instilling an alien ideology and an alien set of values in a people disoriented by an unnatural and spiritually unhealthy lifestyle. The hell they're going through now is at least knocking some of the foolishness out of them and leaving them quite a bit more receptive to a correct worldview than they were before. Our first task was to weed out and eliminate the alien elements and the race criminals from the new enclave. It's astounding how many dark, kinky-haired Middle Easterners have invaded this country in the last decade. I believe they have taken over every restaurant and hot dog stand in Maryland. We must have shot at least a dozen Iranians just in our little suburban enclave, and twice that many escaped when they realized what was happening. Then we formed the people into labor brigades to carry out a number of necessary functions, one of which was the sanitary disposal of the hundreds of corpses of refugees. The majority of these poor creatures were white, and I overheard one of our members refer to what happened to them as a slaughter of the innocents. I am not sure that is a correct description of the recent Holocaust. I am sorry, of course, for the millions of white people, both here and in Russia, who died, and who have yet to die before we have finished in this war to rid ourselves of the Jewish yoke. But innocence? I think not. Certainly that term should not be applied to the majority of the adults. After all, is not man essentially responsible for his condition, at least in a collective sense? If the white nations of the world had not allowed themselves to become subject to the Jew or Jewish ideas, to the Jewish spirit, this war would not be necessary. We can hardly consider ourselves blameless. We can hardly say we had no choice, no chance to avoid the Jews' snare. We can hardly say we were not warned. Men of wisdom, integrity, and courage have warned us over and over again of the consequences of our folly. And even after we were well down the Jewish primrose path, we had chance after chance to save ourselves. Most recently, 53 years ago, when the Germans and the Jews were locked in struggle for the mastery of Central and Eastern Europe. We ended up on the Jewish side in that struggle, primarily because we had chosen corrupt men as our leaders. And we had chosen corrupt leaders because we valued the wrong things in life. We had chosen leaders who promised us something for nothing, who pandered to our weaknesses and vices, who had nice stage personalities and pleasant smiles, but who were without character or scruple. We ignored the really important issues in our national life and gave free rein to a criminal system to conduct the affairs of our nation as it saw fit, so long as it kept us moderately well supplied with bread and circuses. And are not folly, willful ignorance, laziness, greed, irresponsibility, and moral timidity as blameworthy as the most deliberate malice? Are not all our sins of omission to be counted against us as heavily as the Jew's sin of commission against him? In the Creator's account book, that is the way things are reckoned, nature does not accept good excuses in lieu of performance. No race which neglects to ensure its own survival, when the means for that survival are at hand, can be judged innocent, nor can the penalty exacted against it be considered unjust, no matter how severe. Immediately after our success in California this summer, in my dealings with the civilian population there, I had it thoroughly impressed on me why the American people do not deserve to be considered innocents. Their reaction to the civil strife there was based almost solely on the way it affected their own private circumstances. For the first day or two, before it dawned on most people that we might actually win, the white civilians, even racially conscious ones, were generally hostile. We were messing up their lifestyle and making their customary pursuit of pleasure terribly inconvenient. Then, after they learned to fear us, they were all too eager to please us. But they weren't really interested in the rights and wrongs of the struggle. They couldn't be bothered with soul-searching and long-range considerations. Their attitude was, just tell us what we're supposed to believe and we'll believe it. They just wanted to be safe and comfortable again as soon as possible. And they weren't being cynical. They weren't jaded sophisticates, but ordinary people. The fact is that the ordinary people are not really much less culpable than the not-so-ordinary people, than the pillars of the system. Take the political police as an example. Most of them, the white ones, are not especially evil men. They serve evil masters, but they rationalize what they do. They justify it to themselves, some in patriotic terms, protecting our free and democratic way of life, and some in religious ideological terms, upholding Christian ideals and equality and justice. One can call them hypocrites. One can point out that they deliberately avoid thinking about anything which might call into question the validity of the shallow catchphrases with which they justify themselves. But is not everyone who has tolerated the system also a hypocrite? Whether he actively supported it or not, is not everyone who mindlessly parrots the same catchphrases, refusing to examine their implications and contradictions, whether he uses them as justifications for his deeds or not, also to be blamed? I cannot think of any segment of white society, from the Maryland rednecks and their families whose radioactive bodies we bulldozed into a huge pit a few days ago, to the university professors we strung up in Los Angeles last July, which can truly claim that it did not deserve what happened to it. It was not so many months ago that nearly all of those who are wandering homeless and bemoaning their fate today were talking from the other side of their mouths. Not a few of our people have been badly roughed up in the past, and two that I know of were killed when they fell into the hands of rednecks, good old boys, who, although not liberals or shabos goyim in any way, had no use for radicals who wanted to overthrow the government. In their case, it was sheer ignorance. But ignorance of that sort is no more excusable than bleating sheep like liberalism of the pseudo-intellectuals who have smugly promoted Jewish ideology for so many years, or than the selfish and cowardiceness of the great American middle class who went along for the ride, complaining only when their pocketbooks suffered. No talk of innocence has no meaning. We must look at our situation collectively in a race-wide sense. We must understand that our race is like a cancer patient undergoing drastic surgery in order to save his life. There is no sense in asking whether the tissue being cut out is innocent or not. That is no more reasonable than trying to distinguish the good Jews from the bad ones, or as some of our thicker-skulled good old boys still insist on trying, separating the good niggers from the rest of their race. The fact is that we are all responsible as individuals for morals and behaviors of our race as a whole. There is no evading that responsibility. In the long run, any more for the new members of our own race than for those of other races, and each of us individually must be prepared to be called to account for the responsibility at any time. In these days, many are being called. But the enemy is also paying a price. He's still got a grip on things here, more or less, but he's just about finished outside North America. Although the government is blocking most of the foreign news from the networks here, we have been receiving clandestine reports from our overseas units and also monitoring the European news broadcasts. Within 24 hours after we hit Tel Aviv and half a dozen other Israeli targets last month, hundreds of thousands of Arabs were swarming across the borders of occupied Palestine. Most of them were civilians, armed only with knives or clubs, and Jewish border guards mowed down thousands of them until their ammunition was exhausted. The Arabs' hatred, pent up for 46 years, drove them on, across minefields, through Jewish machine gun fire, and into the radioactive chaos of burning cities. Their single thought being to slay the people who had stolen their land, killed their fathers, and humiliated them for 2 generations. Within a week, the throat of the last Jewish survivor in the last kibbutz and in the last smoking ruin in Tel Aviv had been cut. News from the Soviet Union is very scanty, but the reports are that the Russian survivors have dealt with the Jews there in much the same way. In the ruins of Moscow and Leningrad, during the first few days, the people rounded up all the Jews they could get their hands on, hurled them into burning buildings or into burning heaps of debris. And anti-Jewish riots have broken out in London, Paris, Brussels, Rotterdam, Bucharest, Buenos Aires, Johannesburg, and Sydney. The governments of France and the Netherlands, both rotten to the core with Jewish corruption, have fallen, and the people are settling scores in the towns and villages throughout those countries. It's the sort of thing which happened time after time during the Middle Ages. Of course, every time the people had finally had their fill of the Jews and their tricks. Unfortunately, they never finished the job, and they won't this time either. I'm sure the Jews are already making their plans for a comeback as soon as the people have calmed down and forgotten. The people have such short memories, but we won't forget. That alone is enough to ensure that history will not repeat itself, no matter how long it takes us and no matter to what lengths we must go, we'll demand a final settlement of the account between our two races. If the organization survives this contest, no Jew will, anywhere. We'll go to the uttermost ends of the earth to hunt down the last of Satan's spawn. The organizational principles we are using in Maryland are a bit different from those used in California because the situations are different. Here, unlike Southern California, there are neither natural geographical barriers nor a ring of government troops to separate our enclave from its surroundings. Of course, we did what we could to make up for this lack. We chose a perimeter in the first place, which follows natural gaps in the pattern of man-made structures, although for nearly half a mile, the gap is only the 100-yard width of a highway right-of-way with the system's troops controlling the other side. We plugged some open areas with barbed wire and mines, and we torched buildings and brush outside the enclave, which might provide concealment or cover for snipers or hostile troop concentrations. But if the people in our enclave want to leave, there is really no way our militia can stop more than a few of them. We are depending on three things, much more than the fear of being shot, to hold them. First, we have given the people order, and we are doing a substantially better job of maintaining the order inside our enclave than the government is doing outside it. After the dose of chaos these people have swallowed, all but the most brainwashed do-your-own-thing types are hungry for authority and discipline. Second, we are well on the way to establishing a subsistence economy in the enclave. We have a large water storage tank, which we should be able to keep full just by pumping groundwater from already existing wells. There are 2 substantially intact food warehouses and a nearly full grain silo. There are 4 working farms, including 1 dairy farm, with almost enough production capacity to feed half our people. We are making up our present food deficit by raiding outside the enclave, but by the time we've put everyone to work converting every arable patch of ground to vegetable gardens, that shouldn't be necessary. Last and perhaps not least, everyone in the enclave is indisputably white. We dealt summarily with every questionable case. While outside it is the usual god-awful assortment of whites, mostly whites, half-whites, gypsies, Chicanos, Puerto Ricans, Jews, blacks, Orientals, Asians, Persians, Arabs, and everything else under the sun. The typical cosmopolitan racial goulash one finds in every American metropolitan area these days. Anyone who feels a need for a little brotherhood, Jewish style, can leave our enclave. No doubt that many will feel the need. November 2. We had a long meeting this afternoon at which we were briefed on the latest national developments and given new priorities for our local action program. There has been remarkably little change in the national situation during the past 6 weeks. The government has been able to do very little to restore order in the devastated areas or to compensate for the damage done to the nation's transportation network. Its power generating and distribution facilities and other essential components of the national economy. The people are being left on their own to a very large extent, while the system grapples with its own problems, not the least of which is its renewed uncertainty over the reliability of its military forces. That lack of change is in itself very encouraging, because it means that the system is not recovering the degree of control over the country which it exercised prior to September 8. The government has simply not been able to cope with the chaotic conditions which now prevail throughout wide areas. Our units have been doing everything they can in the way of sabotage, of course, just for the purpose of keeping things destabilized. But Revolutionary Command has apparently been waiting to see what sort of intermediate term situation would gel before deciding the new phase of the organization's strategy. The decision has now been made, and it is for us to begin doing in many other places the sort of thing we did in Maryland last month. We will be shifting a large part of the emphasis of our struggle from guerrilla actions to public and semi-public organizing. That is exciting news. It means a new escalation of our offensive, an escalation which is only being undertaken because of our confidence that the tide of battle is now running in our favor. But the old phase of the fight is by no means over, and one of the most worrisome dangers we are facing is a large-scale military assault on California. Government forces are now undergoing a rapid buildup in the Southern California area, and an invasion of the liberated zone seems imminent. If the system succeeds in California, then it will certainly move similarly against Baltimore and any other enclaves we may establish in the future, despite our threats of nuclear retaliation. The problem seems to be cliché of conservative generals in the Pentagon who see us more as a threat to their own authority than to the system itself. They have no love for the Jews and are not particularly unhappy with the present state of affairs, in which they are the de facto rulers of the country. What they would like is to permanently institutionalize the present state of martial law and then gradually restore order, bringing about a new status quo based on their rather reactionary and short-sighted ideas. We, of course, are the fly in their ointment, and they are moving to squash us. What makes them especially dangerous to us is that they are not as afraid of our nuclear reprisal capability as their predecessors were. They know we can destroy more cities and kill a lot more civilians, but they don't think we can kill them. I conferred privately with Major Williams of Washington Field Command for more than an hour on the problem of attacking the Pentagon. The military's other major command centers were either knocked out on September 8 or substantially consolidated with the Pentagon, which the top brass apparently regard as impregnable. And it damn near is. We went over every possibility we could think of, and we came up with no really convincing plan, except perhaps one. That is to make an air delivery of a bomb. In the massive ring of defenses around the Pentagon, there is a great deal of anti-aircraft firepower. But we decided that a small plane, flying just above the ground, might be able to get through the 3-mile gauntlet with one of our 60-kiloton warheads. One factor in favor of such an attempt is that we have never before used aircraft in such a way, and we might hope to catch the anti-aircraft crews off their guard. Although the military is guarding all civil airfields, it just happens that we have an old crop duster stashed in a barn only a few miles from here. My immediate assignment is to prepare a detailed plan for an aerial attack on the Pentagon by next Monday. We must make a final decision at that time and then act without further delay. And that's it for Chapter 27. Come back tonight for the breakdown and come back tomorrow for Chapter 28. I'll check you YouTubers out later.